Hey friends, it's Mike. It's Wednesday, March 30th, 2022, and we are quickly leaning into April. So what I have here is some charts that have pulled together some odds and ends stuff. Some of it might be a little quirky. I've had them written down for quite a while, trying to figure out when I can insert them into a presentation. So yesterday I sat down and said, you know what? Let me just see if I can pull this into one group of charts and present them. So the first chart is planned presentations for the remainder of the year. And please note at the bottom here, no time frames. When I get to them, I will get to them. I have a lot of stuff on my plate, so I have to try to fit it in between everything else I'm involved in. The first item on the list is a presentation on the Greek mythological god Pan and how Pan lays into the occult agenda of the controllers. We mentioned this in the last roundtable number 3, where we had Sally, Vicky, and Ofer participating. And Sally is doing a deep dive into Pan. And we're going to find how Pan is tied into Dionysus and Lucifer and just the overall occult, esoteric construct of the controllers. And she's still working on that as we speak. The more she digs, the more she finds. But I'm very positive when we do present this, it's going to be very, very intriguing. I'm still planning on doing the presentation about Dr. Henry Truby, who was a professor at the University of Miami. He was an expert in linguistics as well as voice prints and sonograms. And back in the 1968 time frame, he did a voice print and determined that there were different Paul McCartneys singing Beatle songs. And with that presentation, I will go into voice prints and how they're used even by law enforcement in order to identify people. Voice prints are just like fingerprints. They're very, very unique to each individual. The next item on the list is a Beatles/McCartney conspiracy FAQ, where I will answer as many of the questions that I've been asked over time. I've done 2 of these in the past, but every once in a while, I think it's a good idea to do it again, because there are always new folks who are subscribing to the channel, and it helps them to get on board without having to dig through every single presentation or interview that I've done. Okay, so for the rest of 2022, this is what I have on the agenda as of right now. And I will try the very best I can to try to get everything done by the end of the year. Okay, so stay tuned. Okay, so the second slide is titled Billy's Ticker Tape Parade. And what I mean by this is the controllers are going to recognize and celebrate Billy on behalf of his efforts to push their agenda forward. And every time I mention it, there's always a couple of comments that come through where people are extremely angry and agitated that Billy's going to be recognized for his efforts. And some of these folks misconstrue me saying this as meaning that I support him being recognized, which I don't. All I'm doing is explaining what the controllers do when somebody who is a significant cog in their wheel to push the agenda forward has delivered results. And so they're going to reward them. That's all I mean by that. And we can see this with many, many players that have come and gone who were pushing the internationalist plan. And Billy is one of these people. And he's been at it for a very, very long time. So when I talk about the ticker tape parade, I look at 2009 as the moment when it began. His recognition began, where they started to ensure that he was going to have this legacy. And in 2009, Beatles Rock Band was released, and of course Billy was heavily involved in this. The Past Masters CD was released with its 33 songs. And 2009 was also the year that the first edition of Memoirs was published. And then in 2018, we had Egypt Station, which in my opinion was a subpar album. The album was released on September 7th of 2018. And when we look at the numerology, the day 7, the month 9, 20, 18, 2 plus 0 plus 1 plus 8, we get 27, and then 2 plus 7 equals 9. So Egypt Station is encoded with number 9 numerology. Then in 2020, we had McCartney 3, another album that I consider to be subpar. It's not a great album. And we are told it was Billy's 18th studio album. And of course, 1 plus 8 equals 9. So McCartney 3 is also encoded with the number 9. And then in 2021, we had the Hulu special. We had Peter Jackson's Get Back. And Billy released the lyrics. And this year, 2022, he is going to tour again at the age of 85. And that tour starts next month in April. And he's releasing another book, McCartney Legacy. And you can see the image here on the right. And that book is going to be released in November of 2022. They're taking pre-orders now. I did not find an exact date, but if I had to guess, it would be either November 11th or November 22nd. If we recall, JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And on November 22nd, 1963, that was the same day that the Beatles released their second UK album, With the Beatles. So With the Beatles was released on the very same day that JFK was assassinated. And November 22nd is an occulted date because if you take the month, November, which equals 11, and the day, 22, and you add them together, you get 33. So if I were a betting man, my bet is that McCartney Legacy is going to be released on November 22nd. And we'll have to see what happens. Now, there's another date in 2023, and that date is getting closer and closer. And this is a date that's mentioned in Memoirs early in the book. And it's February 21st, 2023. Now, I did a video on this, and I'll put the link down below. And I don't know what's going to happen on that date. I don't know whether it means that Billy is just going to retire and ride into the sunset, or whether that's a date in which he's going to pass away. I have no idea. And so if we look at this timeline, starting in 2009, and by the way, this is just a sampling. There's a lot of other activity that Billy has been involved in that is not on this list. But what we can see is a clear ramping up of his, quote, legacy to ensure that his position in history is solidified. And again, this is something that the controllers do. They reward those who they feel made a major contribution to their cause. And Billy has been at it for a long time. All right, so with the next slide, this came to me via an email from somebody who has written me over time. And anytime they have written me, they've always had some very, very interesting observations. So take a look at this one. Beatles Maggie May equals Margaret Augusta Elliott Asher, wife of Richard Asher and mother of Jane Asher. And of course, Jane Asher was biological Paul McCartney's girlfriend. So we have Maggie, which is short for Margaret, M, Augusta, A, Elliott, E, May. And then she points to Rod Stewart's song, Maggie May, and she's asking, is it Margaret Augusta Elliott? And then she goes on to say, now read the lyrics of both. And she's referring to Rod Stewart's Maggie May and the Beatles' Maggie May. Something strange happened with her, perhaps with Rod Stewart, 31 years her junior. So I will put the link down below to both Maggie May's songs so you can take a look for yourself. I'm not going to go through the lyrics here, but it was a very interesting observation. In Rod Stewart's Maggie May, he's talking about having an affair with an older woman. Is it Margaret Asher? I don't know. I'll let you decide. But I thought this was very interesting. Okay, so the next slide is a comment that was posted on Steve Farber's Paul is Dead page. And it had to do with Donovan. And of course, in memoirs, Billy tells us that Donovan was completely on board with the replacement and that Donovan was a contributing songwriter. And one of those songs that we believe that Donovan was heavily involved in was the writing of Yellow Submarine. Now, the way this came to me is a friend who was on Steve's page, a member, picked up on this comment and they emailed me and said, "Hey, Mike, this comment was posted on Steve's page and I thought you would be interested." And I asked my friend if they would reach out to the person who posted the comment and if they would be willing to come on the show to talk about the conversation that they had with Donovan. And unfortunately, the person declined. They didn't want to have a one-on-one conversation, which is fine. A lot of people just don't want to go like public with this stuff, and I understand that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the post. I want to thank this person for putting this comment up because it's very, very important and it's very enlightening. Okay, so I'm going to read it. I have to put my readers on, otherwise I won't be able to read it. So here it goes. A few years ago, I attended a Donovan concert in San Francisco and I paid for one of those meet and greet tickets. I actually got up the nerve and asked Donovan how the Beatles could write so much great material so quickly over the years, and especially during the Beatlemania years. He told me that, quote, "There's more to the story than likely anyone will ever know." He said that he had, quote, "brought them a few silly songs, but that there were others in the fold." I was shocked that he even answered me at all. And that he said that the songs were silly threw me for a loop. I was expecting nothing and got gold. It was almost like he was unloading some information that he had been holding inside. That was the sense I got. The last thing he said to me as he walked away, quote, "There was a genius songwriter, and he didn't give me his name, that would take care of things like this while the boys were out gallivanting. I'll never forget those words." The meeting was only a couple of minutes, and I'll never forget it. I couldn't believe he even answered me at all. I remember him being in a lot of pain, and he had a cane and was being assisted by a younger man. I guess I was feeling a bit bold at this point because I asked him if he could tell me the genius man's name. He just gave me a half smile and shook his head and said, quote, "I think I've said enough. I'll never forget this encounter. And by the way, he put on a really good show. He signed an album for me. Very nice man." So, there you go, folks. The disclosure comes in bits and pieces. There's not going to be a single source for any of this stuff. But what this goes to show is there are people out there that have pieces to the puzzle. And the more we can bring this type of information together will allow us to put more pieces of the puzzle together. And so we can see the bigger picture. But that was a great post. And I appreciate that person making that comment. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Billy to play Glastonbury. And of course, Glastonbury has the pyramid stage. It's very occulted. And to the right is the official advertisement. Glastonbury Festival of Contemporary Performing Arts, Worthy Farm, Pilton, Somerset, the 22nd through the 26th of June, 2022. And so let's take a look at some of the dates and do the numerology. So the dates of June 22nd, 2022 through June 26th, 2022 has numerology of 9. So how do we get there? June 22nd, 2022 is 6 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 2, which equals 16. 1 plus 6 equals 7. June 26th, 2022 equals 6 plus 2 plus 6 plus 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 2, which equals 20. 20 is 2 plus 0, and 2 plus 0 equals 2. and 7 plus 2 equals the 9. The last day of the festival, on June 26, 2022, has numerology of 11. And how do we get there? As we mentioned in the previous bullet, June 26, 2022 equals 20. 20 reduces down to 2. And what is 2 comprised of? It's comprised of 1 plus 1, or 2 ones, or the number 11. So the entire Glastonbury festival, with its pyramid stage, is completely immersed in occult numbers as well. Now, Billy's performance date is going to be on June 25th, 2022. And so June 25th reduces to the number 10. How do we get there? 6 plus 2 plus 5 plus 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 2 equals 19. 1 plus 9 equals 10. And as we know, the number 10 represents completion and new beginnings. And in my McCartney 3 presentation, going back a while ago, I had mentioned that the number 10 is popping up more and more with Billy now. And so what that is telling me is that he is reaching the end of his runway, one way or another, whether he's going to retire or he's going to pass away. He's setting the stage. No pun intended with Glastonbury. But he's setting the stage for his departure. And the fact that he's performing on June 25th and that date reduces to the number 10, I think is very significant. And there was a comment that was left about a week ago where somebody said that Glastonbury was going to be Billy's swan song. And I believe that could very well be the case. Okay, so the next slide is titled The Writers. And yes, I put some headphones on because I'm going to play the audio and I don't want to have it interfere with the playback. The first clip is in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And it's an interesting clip because Ringo is talking about the songwriters. And he does not refer to the songwriters as John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but as the writers. And the second clip, which was sent to me by a listener, comes from the Beatles YouTube channel, and it's a mini doc on Help, and George Harrison makes a very interesting comment. So let's listen to Ringo and hear what he has to say.
Our whole attitude was changing. We'd grown up a little. I think Grass was really influential in a lot of our changes. Especially with the writers, you know, so because they were writing different stuff, we were playing differently. We were all, you know, expanding in all areas of our life, you know, opening up to a lot of different attitudes.
Okay, so Ringo says that because the writers were writing different stuff, they were playing differently. So it's a further delineation between the band itself and whoever is writing the songs. Now let's take a listen to George Harrison. And again, this comes from the Beatles YouTube channel, and it's a mini doc on Help. Listen very closely to what George says.
I had these two guys who used to write songs whenever we needed some. I think we just called them up and said, look, we'll be doing a movie now, lads. Will you come up with a couple of catchy hits?
Okay, so he said that he had these two guys that were writing songs, and he said, hey, we're doing a movie. Could you come up with some catchy hits? Now, the video does some slick editing in order to cover for what George said, and let me just point it out to you. I'll go back.
I had these two guys,
and so what the video does is they give you the imagery of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And this is to associate what George is saying to Lennon and McCartney, when, in my opinion, it had nothing to do with Lennon and McCartney. But they edited the video in order to make the linkage.
We used to write songs whenever we needed some. I think we just called them up and said, look, we'll be doing a movie now, lads. Will you come up with a couple of catchy hits?
So we just called them up, and could you come up with some catchy hits? So did John Lennon and Paul McCartney call themselves up? George said, we would call them up. So very, very telling. Now, one of the comments below that video that I picked up on was very interesting. And the reason why it's interesting is because this person, their critical thinking kicked in initially because he heard what I heard, and I'm sure what virtually everybody who's watching this heard. George is talking about outside songwriters. He's not talking about John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But then what happens is the conditioning kicks in, and he starts to rationalize that it could not possibly have been outside songwriters. It had to be John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So let me just read this comment. I had a panic attack when George alluded to having ghostwriters make tunes for filler on their albums. But then it sunk in that the two lads were John and Paul, and a big smile face. I knew it wasn't true from the outset, but I couldn't figure it out. And the reason why this person was perplexed is because, as I mentioned, their critical thinking kicked in first. And they heard exactly what George was saying. We call these guys up, and these guys would write songs for us. And then, of course, the video lays in the image of Lennon and McCartney to make the association. But clearly, in my opinion, George was telling us they were outside songwriters. And this person here, because of the conditioning, started to rationalize, and he had to fall back into the comfort zone. He had to fall back into the Cinderella story. Okay, so that is that chart. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so this chart has to do with Philip Norman, who is an author and who has written books about the Beatles and other bands. And this was an interview that they did with George Harrison back in the 1980s. And I believe it was a program called West 57th Street. So let's take a listen to what Philip has to say.
Philip Norman is the author of Shout, which many consider the definitive Beatles biography.
The Beatles is not a normal story, it's a supernatural story. And the pressure was supernatural, and it required supernatural luck and forbearance to recover from it. And he has recovered from it. He's the one that we're going to have to ask about the Beatles. There's no one else to ask now.
So he's referring to George Harrison, so we're going to have to ask George Harrison. And isn't it interesting that he used the word supernatural in one sentence? Supernatural, magic. I don't think that was accidental, but that's just me.
Because McCartney won't tell you. Ringo can't tell you. John isn't here.
When you say Paul won't tell you, what do you mean?
He rewrites history all the time.
And Ringo can't tell you because...
He doesn't know.
He doesn't know?
No, he just, he drank the drink, he smoked the joints, he had the girls, and he drummed the drums. That was Ringo.
So he tells us that Billy, he rewrites history. And of course, he came out with the lyrics last year, and he's coming out with McCartney Legacy this year in November. And again, we get another viewpoint on Ringo, which is not flattering. So let's move to the second video. And okay, so the volume is up. Let's take a listen.
As soon as Harrison took the sitar into the studio, he became important, because up to that point, George Martin, the producer of the Beatles, was terrible to him. He used to say, you will play these notes. Here they are on the piano. You will play this. He was the underdog of the Beatles.
Okay, so here we have a statement by Philip Norman where he's saying that George Martin was dictating the notes that George Harrison would play on the guitar. And I'm going to say that if you have to dictate to a musician what to play, if you have to show him play this note, then this note, and this note, and it also means that the person that you're teaching or dictating to has to go off and practice and rehearse. They're just not going to pick it up on the fly. That tells me that George Harrison was not playing on the recorded tracks. And as I mentioned, I don't believe any of the Beatles were playing on the recorded album tracks between 1962 and 1966. And I think that this adds fuel to my argument. What George Martin was doing was teaching them the songs that they were going to take out on the road and play live. So they're playing live had nothing to do with who was in the studio recording the actual tracks for the album. Now, let's talk about the sitar, because this, to me, is also something that is a story. Going back into the 1960s, and I've covered this in another video, there was a studio musician by the name of Big Jim Sullivan. Jim has passed away. And Big Jim was one of the most sought-after studio guitarists in the 1960s to do studio work. So I pulled this information here from a Wikipedia entry on Big Jim Sullivan, and here's what it has to say. In the 1960s, Sullivan learned to play the sitar, having been inspired by attending a recording session for Indian classical musician Vilayat Khan. I hope I said the name right. Sullivan released an album of Indian-style recordings under his own name, Sitar Beat, in 1967, and one as Lord Sitar in 1968. The Wikipedia entry also goes on to say, and I don't have it here, that Big Jim Sullivan would visit George Harrison for rehearsal. What I think was going on was that Big Jim was teaching George how to play the sitar. And I have said in other videos that I believe the sitar that's being played on Norwegian Wood is not George Harrison. It's Big Jim Sullivan. When I did my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, one of the researchers that I was connected into is in the music industry and very accomplished. And he said to me that the guitar playing on Norwegian Wood was not John Lennon or George Harrison, that the guitar playing was way above their play grade. So it's possible that Big Jim not only played the sitar on Norwegian Wood, but he also did the acoustic guitar tracks. Okay, so food for thought. Okay, so with this slide, George and Ringo, they don't practice. And this is a clip that I put up on my community page, and I'm not sure how many people actually got to see it, but let's take a listen to what George has to say about his disciplines and Ringo's with regard to rehearsing.
On your album is also Ringo Starr, and you said, he is like myself with the guitar. What did you mean by that?
Well, we've grown, for so many years, grown up together, and as a drummer, I know Ringo is a great drummer, but he is bad, he doesn't practice. But it doesn't seem to matter. He just picks up the drumsticks, and for my songs, he's very good because he listened to the song once, and he knows exactly what to play. He was the kind of drummer who never likes drum solos. So he just keeps good time, and he instinctively knows when there's a little piece that needs a fill. And it's the same with me. You know, people call me a guitar player, and in a way I'm a guitar player, but I never practice. There's years and years in my life where I never picked the guitar up except just to make a record. But I know I could be quite good, but I don't practice enough.
Okay, so here we have an example of George being very honest about his guitar playing, his guitar skills. He says, I know I could be good, but that's only if I practice. And he's telling us that he doesn't practice on a regular basis. And in fact, he said that years can go by where he didn't even touch the guitar, and he would pick it up when he went into the studio to record. Now, I would argue that if that's the case, then it's likely that some of the guitar playing that we are hearing on George's solo albums, where the guitar playing is credited to him, might not be him, if this is the case. You know, if you don't practice, folks, and all of my musician subscribers and listeners, please chime in down below. If you don't practice, it's very difficult just to pop in and wing it and nail it. Practice is required. And again, we get another unflattering piece of information on Ringo. And this goes back a number of years ago to the Quincy Jones interview that he did with Spin Magazine, where he said that the Beatles were no playing MFers. And he not only mentioned McCartney, and we don't know whether he meant Billy or biological Paul, but he really focused on Ringo. And in that story, Quincy Jones had said that they were working on Ringo's own album, a solo album, and Ringo could not nail the drum track. And so Quincy told him to go take a break, and he called in Ronnie Verrill, the great session studio drummer, and Ronnie has passed away, and Ronnie did the drum track. And I did a video going back, I guess about a year and a half ago, where I had received information from a family member of Ronnie's, and they confirmed that Ronnie did indeed drum on Beatle tracks. And in this case, in the Quincy Jones story, it wasn't a Beatle track, it was a solo Beatle song, and it was Ringo's. So in the early days, from a drumming perspective, we had Andy White, which is admitted to in the official narrative by George Martin, and they claim that Andy White only drummed on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do, but I question that narrative. I don't see how it is that George Martin would only hire him for 2 songs. I think Andy White probably drummed on the entire Please Please Me album. And then we have Bernard Purdie, who stepped forward in the 1970s and has never backed off his statement claiming that he drummed on 21 early Beatles songs. And when he says early Beatles songs, he means between the period of 1962 and 1966. In fact, Bernard came out with a book in 2014 titled Let the Drums Speak, and he has an entire chapter dedicated to the Ringo Starr controversy. And for 50 years, Bernard has not backed off that story. And Bernard drummed for Aretha Franklin for 25 years. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when the Sgt. Pepper movie came out with Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees, I believe it was in 1978, George Martin was heavily involved in the soundtrack of that album, and Bernard Purdie drummed on many of the soundtrack songs. So I don't know whether that was a nod to Bernard for the work that he did in the early days. I don't know, but it's interesting how the cast of characters keep popping up over and over again. Okay, so the next slide, Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench of the Heartbreakers discuss Ringo's double. Now, I had this up initially, and I thought it was Mike Campbell speaking with Tom Petty, because the voice sounded an awful lot like Petty, but the person who sent me the clip, Todd, said, no, Mike, it's Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench of the Heartbreakers, and they had this discussion after Petty passed away. So I re-uploaded the video with the correct information. And Todd, thank you for writing me and setting the record straight. So let's take a listen to what Mike and Benmont have to say about Ringo and his double.
They know each other, so I thought, absolutely, let's get Ringo on the drums and Tom on the bass. And so Ringo was down for it. And I called Tom to come down and play bass. And Ringo didn't come. Actually, he called a week later, said, I'm ready. And I said, you missed it. He said, I got the date wrong. I said, come down here and slap a tambourine on it. And the tambourine's mind-blowing. But Tom came down and played bass and on this song, Blonde Girl in the Blue Dress, because he had to be on the record.
That's so funny about Ringo. He kind of did the same thing to us on the video for I Won't Back Down. We went over to do it, and he agreed to do it, and George and Jeff Lynne, and so the first day we're down there, and it was one of those early video calls where it's cold at Twickenham or wherever, and he comes and goes, why did I say yes to this? Yeah, with an attitude, but he did great. And then the second day, when we came in to do it, he didn't show up. He sent a Ringo double. There was this guy that looked just like him, and we did the far shots. And this guy, he worked for Ringo. Whenever Ringo couldn't show up or didn't want to go, he just sent his lookalike.
God bless him. That's really thankful. I love that guy. And he did show. He showed within 10 minutes When I said, no, man, we cut that a few days ago, and he came down with a bag full of percussion and played a great tambourine, and Tom's playing bass on this.
Wonderful. That's a great story.
Okay, so there you go. They are talking about a Ringo double, and that just firms up the theory, which I'm not even sure it's a theory anymore, that they all had doubles and lookalikes in play. So if Ringo has a double today, he certainly had doubles going back during the Beatle era, as did McCartney, as did John Lennon, as did George Harrison, as did Brian Epstein, by the way. I saw a video going back a number of years ago where somebody did an excellent job of showing the differences in Brian Epstein. They had two Brians. So there you go. There's the doubles and lookalikes confirmed. Okay, so here's the last chart, and many of you have seen this, but this is a great clip, and Graham Nash gives us that wink and a nod and that smile at the end, and it just tells the whole story. So here we go.
May have faded from the public appreciation is the fact that times move on. You know, I mean, there are people that think that Paul McCartney was in Wings. May have faded from the public appreciation is the fact that times move on. You know, I mean, there are people that think that Paul McCartney was in Wings.
That's absolutely great. I love the look he gives us at the end, and it just tells the entire story. All right, everybody, that's it. And the comment section is open. You guys tell me what you think. You have a great day, and we will talk soon.